So thanks a lot for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk here. And as we already heard, it's quite fascinating that Microsoft is sponsoring all these open source events nowadays, and even say that I like open source, which I think is not true. But I'm always saying that if they really would like open source, they would open source some of their core products like Windows or Office, but they don't. But yeah, it's good to be here, and even with Microsoft as a sponsor to have this talk here. So a little bit about me. I'm doing open source for a long time. For background as a developer, developed open source for over 25 years, or longer than that. Was active in a lot of different projects. In KDE, for example, helping the W3C with some standards. Actually, I was part of the group which designed the ActivityPub standard, which is nowadays used by Mastodon, which is very interesting, also with Twitter nowadays. I'm active with lobbying for open source in different organizations, helping the United Nations a little bit with the open source strategy. But of course, I'm invited here as founder and CEO of Nextcloud. So there's this saying that data is the new oil, which means that data becomes like super critical for our society, for our industry, for our life in the future, and already is. In the same way, software is really critical for our life and our industry. There's from Mark Andreessen, founder of Netscape, the saying a long time ago, but still true, that software is eating the world. So basically, software is disrupting one industry after another. And yeah, software and data are really super critical for our future. Which then brings me to the term digital sovereignty, which I think is an interesting term, because as I said, I'm personally fighting for open source for a long time. And often when I'm asked by a politician, open source, why should we really care about it, what is it? Then the answer for a long time was like, open source is this really cool software licenses we have. And after that, they're shutting down because who is interested in software licenses? That's the most boring thing ever. This is why I really like the term digital sovereignty, which at the end means something very similar, that you're in control of your digital life. But digital sovereignty, of course, means a little bit more than software license. It really means being in control. And I also like the term because it works for individuals, it works for companies, it also works for government. So everybody wants to be in control of their digital destiny. So what's the definition of that? I think this is from Wikipedia. Yeah, digital sovereignty means that you the degree of control of individuals, organizations, or governments have over their data on online platforms and on local machines. So why is this important? Of course, there are some risks associated to that if you're not in control. The first is a social one, that you might lose control over your data, like your data is stored on machines somewhere else, outside your control. Maybe they're monetizing your data, maybe they're surveilling your data, maybe they're just like hosted under different jurisdiction in a different country where you really don't know what's going on, and you have no legal way to protect your data. It's obviously a risk. Second one is political. We know that internet platforms, cloud platforms are nowadays used for influencing elections. Just yesterday were elections in the US. It's actually fascinating that last week, I don't know if you follow that, but the boss of the Russian Wagner group for the first time confirmed that they influenced the last presidential elections in the US. So it's basically officially confirmed now. So this kind of political risk is really real. It can really threat our democracy, and this is why digital sovereignty is important. Next one is a very practical one. This is commerce. During the pandemic, we know that we relied a lot on delivery services. Obviously, Amazon is super dominant here. So it's a bit of a crazy future where, I don't know, we all rely on one big corporation to deliver all our foods and all our stuff. So this is another area where we really should be more in control about what's going on here. And the last but not least, innovation. We have to realize that if we all just use cloud services hosted somewhere else, then we are customers or users of these platforms, but there's no way that we can actually look inside how it works. There's no good way to disrupt it. There's no good way to innovate on top of it. There's no good way to study it. If you're in education, you want to learn how this all works, or maybe launch a competitive product. This is all just not possible if you all rely on one big cloud service, which is closed source and hosted somewhere else. So these are all very real strategic risks. Let's talk about two concrete battlegrounds here, let's say, in this talk. One is the legal situation between with data exchange between Europe and the US, and I of course take Microsoft here as a very concrete example. And the second battleground is antitrust. I'll talk about this later. So I think it's very interesting to look at the legal situation, how the data transfer between Europe and the US is handled. I think it all started in 2000. This was the time where the internet was actually a lot smaller. We didn't rely on it too much, but at the time it was already clear that there are some internet companies who provide services, and lots of them are based in the US. And we in Europe wanted to use them, but it was really clear that just the legislation in the US and Europe was just different, especially in the area of data protection, but in other areas too. So this, of course, this was not really compatible. So what happened is that the politician in 2000 created this safe harbor agreement. The safe harbor agreement is basically just a piece of paper, like a contract, which says, we hereby declare that the laws in the US and in Europe are compatible. So, of course, this doesn't change the facts at all. It was just like, we agree that this is compatible, no worries. We can all exchange data, free flow for services and data. This is all no problem, all good. This was safe harbor. Then, a little bit later, there was the Snowden scandal, right? The Snowden revelations, which basically documented that US law enforcement and all kinds of US services have access to the data which is stored in cloud services in the US. It was revealed. Then, of course, Max Schrems, like a law student at the time, thought about it and thought, how is it possible that this like data protection in the US is compatible with the data protection in Europe when the police and secret services can just look into everything? That's obviously not compatible with data protection in Europe. And then he sued against that, and in the highest European court, he actually won the case. And since then, the safe harbor agreement was declared illegal, or not invalid, basically. Because obviously, it's this piece of paper which says that this is compatible is obviously not true, because obviously, a lot of people have access to the data which should be secret. Okay, this is of course then a problem, because suddenly, it's no longer that easy to use this cloud service and exchange data. But no problem, like the politicians sat together and created a second piece of paper, which is then very creatively had a different name, Privacy Shield. But at the end, it was really the same. It was just, hereby we declare that there is no problem, data will be protected, we will follow the laws, no problem, you can complain if you think something is not correct, but we hereby declare that the data is protected here. Of course, same as before, this is just a declaration, and the facts actually didn't change. Then, a little bit later, the GDPR went into effect in Europe, obviously, which made the data protection requirements in Europe even harder. In the US, they went in the opposite direction. They basically, with the Cloud Act, they declared that they want to have access to data, even if it's stored outside the US. If it's just controlled or operated or hosted by a US company, then they want to have access to it, right? So basically, the already incompatible laws basically escalated on both sides in the opposite directions. So obviously, this is not compatible. Then Schrems basically said, okay, let's sue again, because the situation is not getting better, it's actually getting worse. And of course, he won again. So this also means that, as you all know, Privacy Shield is also invalid, because it's a problem that cannot be fixed with a piece of paper. So the current situation is that GDPR and Cloud Act are incompatible. And I'm actually always a bit surprised how easy it is for governments and organizations to just ignore that. But there are some cases where high fees need to be paid for violations, but overall, the strategy at the moment seems to be that, well, we just ignore it. It will be solved somehow in the future. So there's the hope this will somehow go away. Someone will write a better piece of paper, and this will all be better somehow. But if you just look at all the legislation that's going on, like Europe is moving further into the area of protecting data and regulating privacy and the power of big platforms with the DSA, DMA, data law, and other legislations. While in the US, they keep on discussing the opposite direction. For example, there is an initiative in the Senate that they want to access even encrypted data, which is, of course, even more of a conflict. So I think this doesn't really solve itself. There's another try going on at the moment. You might know it from the press. Like earlier this year, Biden and Ursula von der Leyen from the European Commission, they agreed on an agreement in principle, which unfortunately is still not completely clear what's in there, but they're saying that this is solved. This is like solved again, no problem, solved again. So this will be called a transatlantic data privacy framework, which, interesting enough, no one really knows what's in there so far. It's not really public since half a year. We're all waiting for it. But it's already clear that Schrems and other experts are saying, look, this is not going to work. There is some kind of executive order behind it on the US side, which is also not legally binding, can overruled. And it's actually very likely, if they reveal that there will be another court case, and it's actually likely that this will be killed again, because it's just fundamentally not compatible. This just fundamentally doesn't work. So this is the problem on the legal side, on the GDPR side, and I think I cannot imagine, and lots of experts agree with me, that there is an easy solution for that. I think the only solution is actually that we really think a bit more where our data is stored, what software is accessing our data, which legislation is the important one here. And there actually, as you all know here at this conference, very good open source solutions that you can run on premise or in a cloud provider you trust as completely safe and digital sovereign alternatives. And it's something we all should do. But there's this second battleground I also want to cover here, and this is antitrust. So antitrust is something, I don't know how many of you are aware of that. That's a principle which a lot of people think that this is something that is fighting monopolies. It's actually not true. It's actually totally fine to have a monopoly in one area. Like, for example, as Microsoft has a monopoly on desktop operating systems, that's actually totally legal and fine. The only thing that is not legal is if you use this monopoly to get like another one, or to use it as influence to get into a different market. Right? And this is, of course, exactly what is happening here in IT, and especially with Microsoft, like all the time. You all know the case, I think, in the 90s, at least the older ones here, like with the browser wars, where there was an industry which was producing browsers, selling them, making money with it, Netscape, for example. And Microsoft decided, well, browsers are actually strategically important for us. We want to own this, and they just bundled Internet Explorer with Windows for free. No one had to pay for it, which then, of course, killed Netscape. And they basically then won the majority. Later changed again because the software really sucked, okay? But at the beginning, they really were successful to get gigantic market share with their strategy. And this is really not legal. You cannot, if you control one market, like a desktop operating system, use that to really get into a different market by just bundling things together. And they lost this case, and there was this browser selection dialog was mandated. They needed to pay some money and so on. But of course, this doesn't stop them from trying again and again. At the moment, what they're really doing is bundling cloud services with their software. So, as you know, if you ever installed the latest Windows 10 or 11, if you start it for the first time, you really get nice pop-ups like, hey, here's OneDrive. It's already here. The client is already installed. Do you want to use it? It's actually even worse that in the professional edition of Windows, you're automatically logged into OneDrive already once you log in into your Windows account. So you're basically already using it, even if you don't really choose for it. Of course, the first gigabyte is also for free. So this is really like using the monopoly on the desktop operating side to get a monopoly or get into the cloud collaboration market. And of course, there are other examples. In Windows 11, there's Teams already pre-installed nicely in the taskbar. Just click on it and you're already in the chat. And of course, well, using something else is then really hard. You need to download some other software. And this is actually an antitrust violation. So what they're doing is actually really illegal. And what we from Nextcloud side did, together with a nice coalition of other friendly organizations, we filed an antitrust complaint about that at the European Commission. We had some exchanges with them. They asked Microsoft for a statement. Microsoft responded in a letter, something like, cloud services are not really, they're just part of an operating system nowadays. It's just part of it. It's not really bundling. So it's no problem if it's in there, which of course is totally not true because there are lots of services. There's like Zoom and Slack and I don't know, lots of services which are independent from an operating system. So it's not just part of Windows and forget it. It's really illegal bundling here. There was a little bit back and forward, but at the end, the discussion with the Commission was slow. So then, what we then did, end of last year, we decided to go to talk with the press, because at the beginning we requested to stay anonymous, because, I don't know, you don't fight with Microsoft every day, so I didn't know what will happen, no idea. But then we decided, okay, this is not going anywhere, we really need to talk with the press, and they really were jumping on it. This was covered by like hundreds of publications all over the world, and was actually very interesting. What then happened is that I very quickly got lots of new friends on LinkedIn from Microsoft executives. They wanted to talk. There was actually one conversation I had with one of the lawyers, talked with me, but they were not really successful, so they started to talk with other people, other organizations in the coalition, and at the end what they did was asking questions like, hey, is there something we can do for you? Maybe you can sponsor a conference. Maybe we can do some other things for you. So, this is actually what's tried at the moment. Unfortunately, this talk is a little bit too early, because I think in 2 weeks we have some interesting news coming up. I cannot talk about it now, but look out for it. But there's again some movement in this area. So to sum this up, I think if you want to stay in control of our data and our software and our digital life, which is nowadays our life, right? We do everything over the internet, or with phones or whatever. We really need to keep our digital sovereignty, and this requires like open source software, free software. You need to have the choice where to store it. You need to have the way to migrate it between different servers and cloud providers. And I think this is really something that that is really strategically super important for our lives, for our democracy, for our European values here. And tendencies from Microsoft or Google or Amazon that everything should be consolidated in like 3-4 big data silos in the world. This is really the wrong direction. And I think we as an open source free software community should really fight that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Frank. It was a 20-minute talk, so we have to keep the question relatively short. Maybe Peter can prepare the presentation, and maybe there is a question for Frank. Is there a question for Frank? No? Oh, yes, one, please.
I'm kind of prone to all these bad person things, but I'm just wondering, so we take Microsoft and fight against Microsoft, but is it Apple different? I mean, why we don't have the same issue with Apple, for example? Is it Apple more friendly with third-party software, or their business model is different, which makes third-party software better?
No, I think it's exactly the same problem. I mean, the problems are centralized platforms, proprietary code, vendor login, non-open APIs, and so on. And this is the same for Google, for Apple, for Microsoft, for Amazon, for all of them here. Yeah. We're focusing on Microsoft because Nextcloud is affected by that. But at the end, you're right, the problem is bigger.